Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Amazing Podcast. I'm Twain Taylor, editor at Amazing, and I'm excited to be talking again today about something interesting in the cloud native Kubernetes space. We're going to be talking about monitoring. And if you like what you hear on this episode, I want to encourage you to go check out all of our past episodes, at least the ones that you're interested in, because we've done a lot of them over the past 2.5 years. Head over to amazic.com. That's amazic.com. You'll find them there. Or you can even find us on all of the other podcast platforms like YouTube, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. So go and check us out there. I have with me today Jay Khatri, who is the co-founder and CEO of Highlight.io. Jay, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Jay. So, I wanted to get us started with just asking you a bit about yourself and your journey into monitoring and how you got to, in the monitoring space and how you got to start up Highlight.io, where you worked before this. Tell us about yourself.
Sure, sounds good. I can start maybe from more of the beginning, which is maybe in college. I guess since I got to college, I think I realized that the amount of effort to build something that people in the world can use is quite low, like lower than I would have expected, right?
Wow.
And so throughout all of college, I was kind of tinkering with different things. I started going to a lot of hackathons, which is kind
Mm-hmm.
of where I met a lot of my friend group that I'm now very close to after college.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, one of the things that I think I really was excited about was starting a company. And so just towards the end of college, actually, I started my first company, and we were basically sort of a competitor to, if you're familiar with Vercel, they have like preview environments that you can create from in Vercel. And so we basically built like a competitor to that, which was pretty cool. And we made it very easy for engineering teams to spin up their own preview environments on whatever infrastructure they wanted to run it on.
Mm-hmm.
So we built that. It kind of became like a consultancy over time though, and it like wasn't very scalable because it was like everyone had very different setups and things like that. But at first it was a really, or in general, it was a really good experience. And it kind of was my first foray into startups.
Mm-hmm.
After that, we started Highlight. And so Highlight is essentially an open source monitoring platform. But in the early days, essentially what we were building was a way to uncover the issues that are happening on your client side application. So that was kind of actually from a lot of experiences with the previous startup and previous jobs that I had, where, a customer might complain about an issue and you have a bunch of logs in front of you, but how do you actually understand what the customer was experiencing when that issue happened, and so essentially what that turned into in the first version of Highlight was a tool that let people see what users were doing on their site, which is what I'll get into the demo soon. But then also connecting that to any downstream errors or logs that happen on my backend services. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's kind of the general focus of Highlight. We started with just the session replay tool, and then we've kind of moved from there to kind of do a lot more things that connect to that same session replay environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, interesting. And did your audience change? Did you start out with a particular audience in mind, and then as it evolved, has your audience grown broader, or has it totally switched to a different target audience? Who do you build for?
Yeah. It's a good question. So I would say it broadened a
Mm-hmm.
lot. I don't think our audience changed in terms of like flipped to a different type of audience, but it definitely broadened. And
Mm-hmm.
a function of that was the fact that early we were just doing the session replay tool, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
often you sell more to engineers, front end developers, those types of
Wait
folks.
testers, maybe.
Exactly, exactly. But then over time, you start building more server side logging and tracing, and I'll show you what the platform looks like in a second. And that kind of
Mm-hmm.
opens up to more DevOps folks, backend engineers, that kind of thing. And I think
Mm-hmm.
what we realized is like having sort of like a cohesive view of the of your application, not only
Mm-hmm.
from like a value perspective is valuable, but also it kind of brings together teams and
Mm-hmm.
makes it easier so that they collectively can solve these issues faster, you know? So yeah, definitely has broadened, but I think there's also a lot of other things that have benefited from the fact that we've broadened too, you know?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right. So tell us about how monitoring has evolved in the recent years. To get a bit more specific within monitoring, you mentioned logs and I think traces you mentioned. But just talk to us about how monitoring has changed, especially in the past few years with all of the changes that have been happening in the space. Because cloud computing as it was 10 years ago is so different from today. 10 years ago, DevOps was all the rage and CI/CD was big. But, fast forward to today, a lot of that has evolved. It's not outdated, but the conversations have moved on to things beyond those or sure, maybe things that didn't exist at that time,
Yep.
Kubernetes related tooling and all of that. So tell us about how all of this has really affected monitoring.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think when I think there's maybe a big there are like two big waves that have happened in the monitoring world over the last 10 years or so. I think
Mm-hmm.
the first big wave was cloud native, right? It's the idea that people and lots of companies are moving from their own on-prem servers or running things within their own cloud to running things on AWS and GCP and those types of other platforms, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
with that, a lot of new tooling was built, like Kubernetes, like Terraform, those types of things, right? Where it made it easy for people to spin things up, spin things down, and kind of build tooling around their cloud native environments, right? Um, I think that opened up a lot of possibility for new monitoring tools where if I'm running something on another platform, how can I send data, how can I get data from it and then kind of make use of it, right? And for example, if I'm in a Kubernetes environment, there might be some sort of there were monitoring constructs specific to those types of environments. That is what turned
Mm-hmm.
into a lot of the monitoring companies that were successful at the time, Datadog, New Relic, those types of companies. I think
Mm-hmm.
the second big wave is actually kind of where monitoring has moved from, or not even monitoring, but computing has moved from like things like Kubernetes and having to run your own containers to actually managing your own code instead. Meaning that a lot of developers today don't even have to worry about the underlying containers and servers that their code is running on. And we're kind of
Mm-hmm.
moving to a world where they're just writing code that describes their infrastructure. And then
Mm-hmm.
most of their effort is actually put into the logic that runs on these servers, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's kind of what's making companies like Highlight really inflect because these types of companies don't they don't rely on underlying resource consumption metrics and kind of like low level container server metrics, but more
Mm-hmm.
so are really doubling down on the data being sent from the code. Things like the stack trace of an error, or things like where a network request is formed, things like that, and which I'll show you, which I'll definitely show you in the demo. But I think
Mm-hmm.
yeah, two waves at a high level, and I think those are have kind of started their respective types of companies after the fact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. In a sense, talking about abstracting infrastructure away and just getting businesses to focus on what they do best and developers to focus on code and building new stuff. Really interesting. What I want to ask though, so would you say then that you build for the developer, you solve for the developer first, and that's your first user in mind when you build? Or do you think that, ops, the abstraction doesn't mean that ops is left out. It just means that things have changed for them. Could you explain this a bit more in terms of what this means for the ops team?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think at very large companies, there will always be an ops team. I
Mm-hmm.
think the only point I'm trying to make here is that more and more of the low-level container work that ops teams do, in
Mm-hmm.
other words, the managing the number of resources that are being allocated or tuning the number of servers that are running, things like that, I think will continue to decrease, right? And so as a
Mhm.
function of that, yes, I think more and more so of our users are developers, but it I think we're kind of at an inflection point where over time, um, the ops folks will become more so like developers in some sense, where they're more so looking at code level observability metrics rather than the container level observability metrics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Hmm. Wow, that's a fascinating shift that you're talking about because I think we're still quite midway, probably in the initial stages, maybe even some would say, of that whole shift.
Yep.
Uh, yeah,
Yep.
and it takes time. These are very long-term trends that I think you're describing. I mean, long-term in the sense that it could take a few years, but I'm not.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting though to talk about this concept of abstraction. I want to bring us to talking about monitoring itself as a market that has become a bit crowded in the past few years. And given that, there's a monitoring tool for every single purpose for, for just really, there's Prometheus for real-time monitoring. There's for tracing, you have Jaeger and all of these, and then you got the application, the APM monitoring tool. So there's just so many. There's the logging tools. There's security monitoring tools. So it is getting very crowded, right? It has been that way more and more. And in that space, what do you, what would you say separates the good from the great? Or how should organizations look at monitoring and observability when they're looking at this many options and they're looking at their business and these are their needs for monitoring and observing? How do they match? How do they put things together so that, they've got the right mix and they got just enough of what they need and they're not overdoing it. At the same time, they're not missing out on what they really need. Could you comment a bit on these things?
Yeah, I think that decision in a lot of companies ends up being a question about consolidation, right? It's like if I
Hmm.
am using a logging tool and a tracing tool and then another tool for security, like is that the best use of my dollar, right? And I think especially in the kind of like market today, that is a question that gets asked a lot, right? So I guess in the monitoring realm in particular, I would just encourage people to think a lot about not just consolidation, not just that a tool like consolidates many tools, but the
Hmm.
fact that they kind of make the fact that they do multiple things better together. And that's another thing that I'll show in this demo today, which is that I think there's a lot of untapped potential in connecting all of the data that you are sending to any number of observability tools to kind of
Hmm.
make it a 10x better experience. And so that's the thing that I would kind of ask a lot to yourself, whoever's listening, right? Is it's like, um, if I have $1 to spend, what should I be doing with it to make the most to make the make the best use of my developers' time and my team's time, so on and so forth, you know?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So we're going to get into the demo in just a minute, but before that, I want to ask if you could give us an overview of what Highlight is, what it does, and what its purpose is all about.
Sure, sure. So Highlight is essentially an application monitoring tool is how I would describe it. But
Hmm.
there's maybe two things that we do particularly differently. The first is that we focus on connecting all of your resources very cohesively. We call this like cohesion internally on the product side of things. And what that
Hmm.
means is that from a given resource, like let's say I'm looking at a log, I can look at
Hmm.
all of the downstream sessions, like user sessions that fired that log. Or I can look at all the related errors that pointed to that log, right? And so it gives me all the context around any resource so that if I'm debugging something in some system, I actually can see the context as to how that thing that I'm looking at was created in the first place, right? Um, and so that's what we call cohesion. And the way that that looks in terms of the product is that we have four main products. We have a session replay product, an error monitoring product, a logging product, and a tracing product. And from a user session, like let's say I'm looking at Twain's user session, I can click into a network request and actually see all the logs that were printed on the back end, all the traces that were thrown on the server, so on and so forth. And so I can go from either direction. I can look at logs and see how the users were impacted. I can look at sessions and see how what logs were thrown. But in general, it gives you the power to say, okay, if I had a customer issue, I don't need to just kind of trust my logging system to know what got fired at the end of the day. I can actually see for myself what the user was doing leading up to those logs being fired. So
Interesting.
that's one big focus of Highlight. Sorry to cut you off. The second thing I'd say is that our product is open source. So we have a lot of customers that actually self-host Highlight, and they use like an enterprise deployment of Highlight, similar to something like GitLab. And that allows them to monitor their system in a more privacy conscious way, right? So instead of having to worry about sending PII for my logs and traces and sessions, I can run this within my own VPC, have my DevOps team or our team help you sort of manage it. And then you can almost use it just like you would any cloud observability tool. So yeah, that kind of covers the two big differentiators in terms of what we do and why we do it. But happy to talk more.
So, which are the key data points that actually make up all of the metrics? I mean, because I saw that you cover quite a bit. You mentioned sessions, you mentioned logs, but I think there's a few more. I think there's probably traces and there's
And
probably
errors.
events. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Could you just give us the entire list?
Sure. So it's sessions, errors, logs, and traces.
Mm-hmm.
That's the entire list. And
Okay.
each of them kind of, I guess, solve for a different use case in some sense, right? So
Mm-hmm.
sessions, what they do is they let you play back how users interact with your site. So with that, I can see when Twain is on my site, I can see what he's clicking on. I can see what requests are firing because of those clicks.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I can even see like, okay, this error, an error was thrown on the front end when he hovered over a specific element, right? So there's a lot of things you
Mm-hmm.
can do that are visual, right? Like I can actually see a video recording of what Twain was doing on my site.
Mm-hmm.
Error monitoring, we basically group together all of the errors on your application. So it gives you the ability to say, okay, out of all the instances of errors, what are the most important ones and which are the ones that are impacting most of my users?
Mm-hmm.
Then there's logging, and logging essentially lets you log data throughout your application, just like any event, right? And people are, I think, very familiar with what logging is. And then there's
Mm-hmm.
tracing, which is more so logs, but for performance.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what the full product suite looks like. We have a lot of other things on top of that. So we have like a metrics tool that lets you create metrics from all that data. We have an alerting
Okay.
tool, which lets you create alerts from specific logs, traces, sessions, or errors.
Uh,
But that's kind of a high level of what we do. And those are the underlying data points, Twain, that you mentioned
got it.
that power
Yeah.
the rest of the product.
Great. Yeah, that really helps to understand the scope of the product, and really cool that you guys have covered so much of it, because each of these tend to be sometimes standalone tools, and you guys have packed a lot into one platform. That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm interested to see a demo of the product and what it looks like. Could you give us a walkthrough?
Sure. Happy to do that. Um, so here I'm actually showing you our session replay tool. And on the left, you can see all of the sessions that I can search for on my application. And I can search for specific emails of users. I can search for identifiers that I can custom send from my front end. But then here on the right, I can actually click play and see how a user is interacting with my site. So here, for example, you can see their cursor is moving in here, and you can see they're clicking on a specific event. And then as this is happening, you get this like distribution of all the events that happen throughout the session. So I know that at this timestamp, the user clicked, this timestamp, the user focused, and at this timestamp, there was a track event called or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of gives you the ability to actually play back retroactively what
Mm-hmm.
went wrong to understand what you should fix, right? Um, then beyond that, we also give you the ability to look at the dev tools, like the browser dev tools of that session at the time. So if I click into this request, I can actually see what traces were fired throughout and see, okay, this was a query that was run to my backend. This was a specific operation that happened on my backend, so on and so forth. So we give you basically the ability to track down everything happening on the client, but all the way down to what's happening on the server. So
Hmm.
that's kind of an high level view of the session replay tool. Hopefully that's valuable. And
Yeah,
maybe I'll spend like a minute on each other product if that works. Does that sound good?
sure. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Now here is the error monitoring tool, which basically the UI looks very similar, but instead of rendering sessions of user sessions, we're actually rendering what errors were happening on the application. So here, for example, I know an error said no metrics provided, and it was on my
Mhm.
backend application. And then I can see in Go the actual stack trace of that error having been thrown. Um, so this is a pretty valuable way to actually understand why something might have gone wrong, to
Mhm.
be able to understand, okay, this is the code that threw it, and this is what I need to fix. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Now, on that same cohesion point where I connected the session to the downstream trace, I can actually look
Mhm.
at all the related logs to this error to understand what logs were thrown around the error. So there was an issue that said no metrics provided here, which is error, but then
Mhm.
around that, there were other logs related. So I know that, for example, this request failed first, and then this
Mhm.
error was thrown.
All right.
So that kind of gives you a high level of like maybe the more front end focused features. Now I'll go to
Mhm.
logs and traces, which I'll go a little faster. But
It
logs is
demonstrates
kind of,
that idea of cohesion that you were mentioning as well, how it's all connected.
yeah, yeah, makes sense, makes sense. You're saying that you kind of understand it now, yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
Understood, understood. So here, if I click into to logs, I can actually search for all the logs on my application. And
Mhm.
essentially what this does is it lets me actually see what is going wrong and just lets me search across all the events that my application has fired. So if I want to look for all the logs where the service name is equal to public graph, this will filter all my logs very quickly and then let me actually click into and see what's going wrong here. Um, Again, if this had a related session or trace, I would actually be able to click into that to see any related events on that front. So it's a pretty
Mhm.
powerful feature in that sense. Um, so yeah, that's kind of a high level of logs. And then traces is very similar in terms of the UI, but instead what we're looking at are actual spans that happen throughout my
Yeah.
application to understand page speed or understand the speed of specific operations in my database. So here, if I
Mhm.
click into error query, oh, this is not a great example. Let's pick another one. So if I click into this, this will actually tell me about all the operations on my backend where
Mhm.
where this specific operation was slow. So as you can see,
Mhm.
this took 4 seconds, which is like longer than normal for our server. And I can click
Mhm.
into this to understand what is actually causing the slowness here. And as you can see here, it's actually not the database query, which is this
Mhm.
small sliver here. It's actually this one field.metrics operation that's slower. So it
Mhm.
lets you uncover why things are slow, and then again connect that to all the downstream sessions and logs. So here I can look at a related session that actually threw that specific trace. So yeah, that's kind of a high level of the product suite. We do have a metrics product, which lets you actually look at metrics for all of these um, data points. So here, for example, I can look at all the requests from a specific service, and I do that by querying the traces here. Um, and then I can run specific like further filters and group bys and aggregations at the bottom. But that hopefully gives you an idea of what Highlight does and how it's powerful. I think the big reason why it's compelling for a lot of teams is because it's very easy to set up. I think a lot
Mhm.
like a lot of the first wave observability tools where you have to install a bunch of agents on your application and
Mhm.
you have to kind of like do a lot of you have to do a lot of work to get even a single point of data over or across. Here, all you got
Hmm.
to do is tell your developers on your team to just simply add a snippet of code, and
Hmm.
then you're good to go. So we try to make it really, really easy, but then actually deliver even more value than those other tools would. And that's kind of how we think about observability in the first place.
Hmm.
The last thing that I'll mention is maybe more so for the folks that are interested in how this is built. Um, Under the underlying data storage layer that we're using is called ClickHouse.
Okay.
And ClickHouse is basically an open source OLAP database that essentially lets you do like a time series queries across all your data. And that really is one of the powerful parts of our system that makes it very easy to make querying so quick. So I
Hmm.
think I did some example queries over the last few minutes, right? And the reason why they're so fast is because of ClickHouse under the hood, because we can basically scale this horizontally as our data volume increases, but then still deliver the same query performance to the end user. So yeah, that's kind of a high level of highlight. Hopefully that's useful. And Twain, I'll let you keep asking me questions if you're curious about anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the last part, I guess one question that came to my mind was, I guess you can probably create multiple dashboards for different use cases, and you can even set up custom alerts based on rules by combining all of the other data and those other parts, right?
Yep.
That's
Yep.
possible.
Exactly. Exactly. You can. It's very easy to do that. You can create as many dashboards as there are teams or even developers on your team.
Hmm.
Um, and it's a very easy way to sort of collaborate and understand what's going wrong on different parts of your system. So, for example, at Highlight, we actually have a dashboard for each service, and that helps us understand, when you get into like a engineering huddle with your team every week, you can kind of look at that dashboard and understand what's the health of my system and is there anything I should be doing to kind of fix anything.
Yeah, yeah, cool. I want to dig in a bit more to ask about open source and self-hosting that you mentioned that some of your customers use Highlight for. Give us a few examples of companies that would take that route. What are some of the use cases that you see most frequently where they want to self-host Highlight? Uh,
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of the folks that self-host don't self-host to save money, believe it or not. Um, because it is kind of a pain, especially if you're a small team and you don't have a DevOps practice to actually maintain a system like Highlight within your VPC.
mhm,
So that's one thing, like even beyond the highlight question, I would warn teams about is that like it might seem like it's a cost saving measure, but I don't think it actually is. Um,
mhm,
it's more that you're required to do that for other reasons. And so those other reasons are often because these customers of ours are in very regulated industries, like they're in healthcare or in fintech, and they can't send data to an external provider at all. And
mhm,
so in those cases, it's either we are deploying Highlight into their AWS account, let's say, or in
mhm,
some cases, we actually will deploy Highlight to their own on-prem servers that are running in
mhm,
in on their like yeah like in their office or in their server farm or whatever. So those it's often like a security measure that they can't get around, and the fact that we're open source and the fact that they can try it out very quickly and then reach out to us unlocks a lot of doors.
mhm. So does the self-hosted route mean that they can opt for getting support and help with setup and management and all of that from you itself, or uh, are they on their own? They just run it on their own. It's open source.
It's a good question. Yeah, it's definitely definitely a possibility. Yeah, we do that with most of our self-hosted large enterprises where we have support built into whatever contract that we have with them.
Okay.
So
All right.
it also but these types of things are done on a pretty case by case basis, honestly, because in some cases teams don't want our team to have access to your account, let's say, right? And in which case there's a little more back and forth to help you in fixing issues, but we try our best to be as hands-on as we can. to
Mhm.
make sure the experience of Highlight is good, whether or not it's on-prem or not.
Okay, okay. All right. Cool. So I think that brings us to almost the end of our conversation. But as we wind down, I want to just get your thoughts on the future for this space, or even for Highlight itself. What catches your attention when you're reading up on stuff? What do you that's happening now, let's say for the next year or so? What are you thinking of building? What's next?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one thing on the Highlight end that I think has been really interesting recently is um the like a new sort of user, a new type of ICP that we've learned from. Um, and so I mentioned that metrics product that I just showed you, right? Where you can create metrics and alerts and things like that. Um,
Mhm,
but we've actually had a lot of product folks in that tool, um, where they realize that I can use this type of tool to understand user activity and user engagement and things like that.
mhm,
Um, and so that has actually opened a lot of doors for us in terms of being able to kind of build more tools for those types of users. And I think it's
mhm.
not crazy to think that in the next year or so, we start building more tools for that sort of user. Um, so that's kind of something that we have on the horizon for sure. The other thing we're thinking a lot about is like mobile. Um, because a lot of our customers, especially those that are in e-commerce or in more consumer sort of avenues, they have a big mobile suite of tools, and then they're using Highlight for their web side of things. So being able to sort of help consolidate and send data also from your mobile apps, I think could be very valuable. So yeah, in general, I think there's a lot we have planned, but maybe those are the top two things we're thinking a lot about.
All right, all right. Very interesting. Cool. Before you go, Jay, just one last question to get to know you a bit. What would be alternate career path if not for your job in tech?
Oh man, that's a tough one. It can't be in tech.
Yeah, no.
Maybe some sort of like designer, I feel like. Maybe like a
All right.
non-tech designer type person. I don't know. But
Uh,
I enjoy building things, right? And I think what I've realized is it doesn't really matter if it's using code or technology. I think there's
mhm.
just a thing in my brain that uh can't get away from making things, you know? And so I think a designer or some sort of artist even maybe could be a possible career path. But yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I saw that your product as well. The UI was really well designed. I like the use of colors. It's quite lively and yet not too bizarre or not too in the
Yeah.
face. It's a nice
Thank you.
balance.
Thank you. Yeah, for what it's worth, you shouldn't credit me for it. The early version of Highlight was definitely a lot of me, but now we have a designer on our team named Julian who does a lot of that work. So shout out to him for that sort of thing.
All right, all right. Cool. Yeah, that was a fun conversation. Thanks for joining us today, Jay. And do come back sometime when you launch something big and tell us about it. We'd love to hear.
Sounds good, Twain. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. And all of our listeners and viewers, thanks for tuning in. We hope you found this conversation really interesting, and we hope you'll come back for more when we talk to others. But do go and check out Highlight as well if you like what Jay was showing us in the demo and what he was describing. If that really resonates, go and check out what they do, and take the open source project for a spin, the tool, and get in touch with them. And with that, I'll see you on the next episode.